Welcome back. This is now our third and final episode on 1 Corinthians chapter 15. This chapter has been like one last mountain to climb before we finish off the letter. Previously, we read about Paul talking about the crucial nature of the resurrection in the Christian worldview, and how without it, we might as well not bother with any of this. Then he began to talk about the end times, and Christ's eventual return to conquer evil, raise everyone up, and judge the living and the dead. Today, he's going to address a question which comes to everyone's mind. What does it mean to get back a resurrected body? What's a resurrected body like? Let's dive in. But someone will ask, how are the dead raised? With what kind of body do they come? You foolish person. What you sow does not come to life unless it dies, and what you sow is not the body that it is to be, but a bare kernel, perhaps of wheat or some other grain. But God gives it a body as he has chosen, and to each kind of seed its own body. For not all flesh is the same, but there is one kind for humans, another for animals, another for birds, and another for fish. There are also heavenly bodies and earthly bodies. But the glory of the heavenly is of one kind, and the glory of the earthly is another. There is one glory of the sun, and another of the moon, and another glory of the stars. For stars differ from stars in glory. So it is with the resurrection of the dead. What is sown is perishable, what is raised is imperishable. It is sown in dishonor, it is raised in glory. It is sown in weakness, it is raised in power. Let's pause. In this section, Paul is going to use some analogies to help his critics understand the resurrection of the body. And he's going to do this by illustrating two principles, which he thinks they should know by looking around at the world. First, he points to the massive bodily transformation that a seed goes through as it sprouts to become a plant. The seed looks nothing like the plant, yet everyone knows this little thing you put in the ground turns into something much more complex and glorious. In that way, it looks like a human dying, being buried, and coming out way different. The second principle he lays out is that there are differences in glory in the created world. He points to the mundane nature of earthly bodies, namely all the creatures dwelling on the earth. Then he directs our attention upward to the superior glory of the heavenly bodies, and then he points out that even among those, there are different levels of glory between the moon and the sun and different stars. If you put these two together, Paul is basically saying you should already be acquainted with the idea of a body going through great metamorphosis, and you should also be familiar with bodies having different types of brilliance and glory. Paul wants you to put these two concepts together. In the resurrection, we will go through a metamorphosis and come out the other end with greater glory. You will be yourself, but you'll be far more than you can possibly imagine. This is all reflected in the Catholic Catechism, which says, "We believe in the resurrection of the flesh, the fulfillment of both the creation and redemption of the flesh. By death the soul is separated from the body, but in the resurrection God will give incorruptible life to our body, transformed by the reunion with our soul. Just as Christ is risen and lives forever, so all of us will rise at that last day." Let's move on. It is sown a natural body, it is raised a spiritual body. If there is a natural body, there is also a spiritual body. Thus it is written, "The first man, Adam, became a living being. The last Adam became a life-giving spirit." But it is not the spiritual that is first, but the natural, and then the spiritual. The first man was from the earth, a man of dust. The second man is from heaven. As was the man of dust, so also are those who are of the dust. And as is the man of heaven, so also are those who are of heaven. Just as we have borne the image of the man of dust, we shall also bear the image of the man of heaven. I tell you this, brothers, flesh and blood cannot inherit the kingdom of God, nor does the perishable inherit the imperishable. Okay, let's pause again. The key here is understanding what Paul means here by natural or earthly and spiritual. The natural or earthly body he's speaking of is the body which is mortal, prone to weakness and decay, and inclines us towards disordered passions. In other words, it's the one you have right now. This fallen nature is all that Adam could pass on to us after the great disaster of his fall from grace. It's tempting to think that when Paul talks about the spiritual body, he's talking about being a disembodied ghost or something that lacks all corporeality. But that's not really what he's after. The spiritual body we have after the resurrection is a real physical body, but properly ordered to the good interests of our souls. It means a body which is like that of Christ after he rose. As it says in 1 John chapter 3, we will be like he is, no longer suffering, free from various limitations. Now, one wishes Paul could have given more specifics about what the resurrected body would be like, But this is really all we get. John says we'll be like Christ. Paul gives us some analogies about the differences between a seed and its plant and the glory of the earthly bodies versus stars. After that, the Bible is basically done informing us on the matter. The rest is speculation. So let's keep moving. Behold, I tell you a mystery. We shall not all sleep, but we shall all be changed. In a moment, in the twinkling of an eye, at the last trumpet. For the trumpet will sound, and the dead shall be raised imperishable, and we shall be changed. For this perishable body must put on the imperishable, and this mortal body must put on immortality. When the perishable puts on the imperishable, and the mortal puts on immortality, then shall come to pass the saying that is written, Death is swallowed up in victory. O death, where is your victory? O death, where is your sting? The sting of death is sin, and the power of sin is the law. But thanks be to God who gives us victory through our Lord Jesus Christ. Therefore, my beloved brothers, be steadfast, immovable, always abounding in the work of the Lord, knowing that in the Lord your labor is not in vain. Alrighty. In this last section, Paul describes Jesus' triumphant return. He depicts this as a big, obvious, public event at the time when there are still human beings on the earth. And I find that interesting, because sometimes people are concerned about a total human extinction event happening on the earth, something like an asteroid or nuclear war. This passage would seem to indicate that such a thing isn't a possibility. If Jesus is going to come to the earth while there are still humans here, that means we can't all be wiped out by future calamities before that happens. There might be calamities that wipe out a lot of us, but not all of us. Now, way back in chapter 7, we talked about the first of Paul's inexplicables. If you recall, it was Paul giving pastoral advice, which made it sound like he believed that the end of the world was imminent. Some people will read this passage as further evidence that he thought the end of the world was going to happen during his lifetime. Because when talking about what it'll be like for those who are alive at the coming of Christ, he refers to such people as we, meaning, supposedly, he thinks that he'll be among those people. And while I'm persuaded that Paul thought that the end of the world was going to happen soon, I don't think Paul's phrasing here is evidence that he thinks he'll be alive when it happens. Why do I say that? Because earlier in this same chapter, Paul is talking about how he's constantly risking his life every day for the sake of the gospel. Even if the end were to happen in a few years, Paul expects that he could be martyred literally any day. So I don't think that he's assuming that he'll be alive at the end. I don't think he's assuming that he'll be alive to the end of the week. So when he says, we shall not all sleep, I think he's speaking generically of we Christians, not necessarily about himself. Anyway, Paul depicts Jesus returning and the dead rising in their immortal resurrected bodies. And for those on the earth at the time, Paul says they will be changed in an instant. That's another interesting thing to talk about, because as Catholics, we believe in the doctrine of purgatory, something we mentioned way back in chapter 3. That doctrine holds that at the close of our lives, those who are united in friendship to God will need to have their personalities purified and sanctified. We typically imagine this as a process which someone has to go through that has a duration of some sort, whether we imagine it as time or some other way. But for those individuals left alive at the end of history, Paul says they'll be changed in an instant. And I think there can be some tension between the idea that those who die under normal circumstances go through a kind of process, but these people get zapped and are changed instantly. If God can do it for them, why not for everybody? I would harmonize these two ideas in two ways, possibly. First, have you ever had a dream that seemed to last a really long time, but in reality you were only asleep for a short time? Perhaps the change these people undergo is something like that. Their subjective experience will be going through a process with some duration, but the objective reality is that it took basically no time at all. Alternatively, it could be like this. For most people, purgatory is God gently healing you and fixing you up over time. But at the resurrection, it's like everybody gets the Band-Aid pulled off all at once. An experience which is fast, but proportionately unpleasant. Either way, the reception of the resurrected body is something that Paul says is the final defeat of death. He says, "Death, where is your sting?" And that makes sense. If the final state of the human person was to dwell as a disembodied soul forever, even if we dwell happily with God, it would still be the case that death has taken something from us. Human beings are supposed to be embodied creatures. Death takes that away. So the resurrection is Jesus restoring to us everything that death stole from us, and more. The last thing I want to look at is Paul saying, "The sting of death is sin, and the power of sin is the law." That sentence looks like it snuck in from Romans chapter 5 or something. Paul just sneaks it in there with no warning, explanation, or context. The latter half of the sentence says that sin is the power of the law. The law is an expression of God's righteousness in the form of a command given to human beings. It tells us what is right and wrong. Over the letter to the Romans, Paul explains how the law is good, but the law itself doesn't have the ability to save anyone. A person can do everything God asks and then only be able to say, as Christ notes in a parable in the Gospel of Luke, "We are worthless slaves. We have done only what we ought to have done." All the law has the power to do is condemn you for breaking it. That's why it says the power of the law is sin. The first half of the sentence is a bit harder to grasp, though. The sting of death is sin. It seems like it would make more sense the other way around. The sting of sin is death, because as we mentioned before, death came into the world through sin. But perhaps what it means here is that sin makes death more odious to us because it makes someone have fear of the punishments of hell. But that's just my best guess. And with that, we have reached the end of the mighty 1 Corinthians chapter 15. See you next time for the grand conclusion.